Greetings. I am Martha Zavala, President of the League of Women Voters, Pasadena area. Welcome to Thursday with the League, holding the LA County Sheriff's Department accountable. Thank you for joining us today. The League of Women Voters is an organization encouraging the informed and active participation of residents in government. We neither support or oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government, but we always work on vital issues of concern to members and the public. Our featured speaker today is Sean Kennedy, member of the LA County Civilian Oversight Commission and associate professor of law at Loyola Law School. He will discuss the challenges facing the Citizens Oversight Commission. After his presentation, you'll have an opportunity to get answers to your questions during our interactive Q&A session. I encourage you all to participate by entering questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please contribute to our event by asking questions. It makes it really important that you understand what is happening in our Sheriff's Department right now. The Q&A question session will be followed by a short take action session that's going to be presented by Ashley Revichet, chair of the California League's Criminal Justice Committee. Before we get to our program, I want to advise you that Pasadena Media is live broadcasting the event on public access TV, and the video will be posted on our League's YouTube channel tomorrow. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Chris Ockerhauser, chair of our Police Practices Subcommittee. She will introduce our speaker and manage the Q&A session portion of our event. Chris, please come on screen and welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, all. I'd like to take a quick minute to share what our Pasadena Area League has been doing regarding criminal justice reform. As a good government organization recently celebrating our first 100 years, the California League has come to address criminal justice issues only in the last 3 years. Our League's Policing Practices Subcommittee got off the ground with a full house community meeting late in 2019, addressing the same topic we are today, holding the LA Sheriff's Department accountable. It featured a civil rights attorney who helped to bring the Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission into being, and the executive director of the commission and a co-founder of Black Lives Matter LA. Our recent work has been focused on helping to implement the historic new law authorizing law enforcement officers' use of deadly force only when necessary to save human life, which I'm sad to say has largely been resisted and not faithfully implemented by policing agencies. We also have been surveying incidents of racial profiling and stops by law enforcement in 4 local cities. But let's turn to the subject at hand. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is the nation's largest and runs its largest jail system. Its sheriff, like most sheriffs in the country, is elected, whereas police chiefs are appointed and can be removed by city councils. Under California law, elected sheriffs are permitted to run the department as they wish. Our sheriff, like most, derives his authority from the state constitution and is subject to removal by the voters. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has recently sought to remove the sheriff, but its hands are largely tied. For decades, our sheriff's department has been mired in charges of inmate abuse and corruption and beset by violent deputy gangs. A decade ago, conditions had so spiraled out of control that the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice opened an investigation of the jail system. Subsequently, the Board of Supervisors, upon the recommendation of a Citizens Commission on Jail Violence, implemented dozens of reforms, including the creation of the Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission as an advisory body to the department in 2017. As the Oversight Commission began addressing the need for greater department transparency, it pushed the sheriff to release more information about deputy-involved shootings and called on him to ground the pilot drone program. The sheriff pushed back, however, on the drone program, telling the commission that they were not a policy-making body. Under the current sheriff, elected in 2018 on a reform program, the disconnect between him and the commission grew from the outset over the department's rehiring deputies fired for misconduct and over dismissal of reforms to reduce force against inmates as a social experiment, over dismissal by concerns by the commission and FBI agents of the presence of deputy gangs in the department, over halting access to documents needed to help the commission monitor the department, and other reforms that were dismissed. With Measure R last year, the voters granted the commission subpoena powers to secure needed documents and testimony. Yet the sheriff has defied even these until directed to do so by the court. The question arises, how can governing bodies secure accountability from the sheriff? Is appointment a better alternative? What are the pros and cons of electing or appointing a sheriff? What other options for harnessing the unregulated power of sheriffs and securing accountability? To its credit, Loyola Law School has been addressing these and other issues of Los Angeles law enforcement accountability in annual series of public forums. Our speaker today, Sean Kennedy, is the law school's executive director of the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy and co-produces these publicly available discussions. Kennedy was the federal public defender for the Central District of California from 2006 to 2014. He's with us today as a member of the Sheriff Civilian Oversight Commission, tasked with prying open greater transparency and accountability of the department. He recently authored a report to the commission on 50 years of deputy gangs in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which he'll talk about this morning. I should add that in his bio from Loyola, he's also listed as teaching in a course named an intensive cross-examination workshop. You can see that on display at commission meetings with the department, which the public can attend online and make comment, and we'll have a slide on that about how to reach them. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Commissioner Sean Kennedy.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for inviting me to speak on the issue of accountability. I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to just do that to help kind of invite some discussion about the issues. So we're going to talk about sheriff accountability, and then I hope we'll have some robust discussion about it. And as Chris alluded to, I think one of the biggest things to understand is the difficulty of achieving accountability with the sheriff's department. It's not unique to LA. All county government that has an elected sheriff has this struggle because on the one hand, municipal police chiefs like Michael Moore of the LAPD are directly appointed. And as a result, civilian politicians who are very focused on their constituencies act as, in many ways, like their boss. And so they're very responsive. That's not to say the Los Angeles Police Department has no problems, but it is much less resistant to civilian oversight, transparency than the Sheriff's Department. And this is because, as we spoke of, Sheriff Villanueva and really all the sheriffs before him are elected countywide. And so often when the sheriff is confronted with an issue that civilian politicians or community members are upset about, he is able to say, look, I answer to the voters. you're not in control of me or my department, and I'm not going to do it that way. That's a plus and a minus. But I think, as Chris has alluded to, it's proven to be problematic in the 21st century. President Obama's task force on 21st century policing in 2015 was a diverse group of professionals, including police chiefs, sheriffs, professors, community activists. And they had noted that the real challenge for law enforcement in our country is to move away from kind of the culture of being a warrior and to move towards a culture of being a guardian or a servant of the community. And so a lot of the issues that I think cause problems in our community are really deep down about the issue of culture change. And it's hard to effectuate culture change when the sheriff can tell everyone, you're not the boss of me. Now, I sit on a commission of 9 volunteers from very different parts of our community. And our goal is to try to achieve more trust and transparency between the sheriff's department and the communities they serve or should serve. And, it's a very diverse group that 5 of the commissioners are appointed by the supervisors. So each member of the board of supervisors appoints one commissioner for his or her, well, I guess right now, her community district. And then there are 4 commissioners who are appointed by the community at large. The community makes recommendations, and then a committee selected them. I'm actually a community at large appointee. I was not appointed by a supervisor, but it's a very diverse group. I sit between, as Chris said, I was a career federal defender. I headed the federal public defender here in LA for many years. But I sit between Rob Bonner, who is a former federal judge who was appointed by the first President Bush, and also a former head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And then on my other side is J.P. Harris, a former sheriff lieutenant who's retired. So we're really a diverse group of people. And we hold monthly meetings. This is when we were live. Right now we're virtual, where the community is able to present its concerns about policing in LA. And we bring in members of the sheriff's department to talk about the issues and see whether or not we can have better communication, maybe real reforms, change in policy. But our problem is that we are only advisory because of this dynamic of an elected sheriff. And so while we can push and make overtures to the elected sheriff and his leadership team, we have no ability to tell him what to do. And in this respect, it's very different than the Los Angeles Police Department Oversight Commission, because that commission is able to tell Chief Moore, you need to change this policy. You need to fire this officer. And so that's a real difference between sheriff and police in Los Angeles. There are some issues that I think really put the camera on the sheriff's commitment to accountability and civilian oversight. And so I thought I would just highlight some before we start our discussion. And one of these is the issue of body-worn cameras. And I don't know if everyone in our audience knows it, but I did a study a few years back, and really, Los Angeles Sheriff's Department was the last big city law enforcement organization in America, in the whole country, to adopt body worn cameras. And for many years, different oversight bodies had suggested that the sheriff use cameras, and there was a real resistance to it. In 1992, James Colts, uh, the late, he was a former LA Superior Court judge from Pasadena, former career DA. He had actually done a study after a series of scandals about use of force, and he had recommended at that time it was dash cams, the cameras on the actual patrol vehicles, and the sheriff said, no, we don't need them, and we can't afford them. And very similar to that, when the commission that I sit on started pushing for body-worn cameras, there was a real resistance both from Sheriff McDonnell and much less so from Sheriff Villanueva, although both really dragged their feet about implementing, claiming a lack of money. The reason that I think that that this is an important reform, and the sheriffs finally, very late to the table, but finally have been implementing body-worn cameras in select stations, but they really ought to be on everyone, because these cameras, I think, are a win-win for everyone. And I'm going to acknowledge here that not everyone agrees with me on this. Before the commission, many community members appear and talk about the theory of the architecture of surveillance, meaning that as law enforcement is given more and more technological surveillance tools, they will be misused. And I do respect that objection. But as someone who, my students and I at Loyola represent at-risk youth pro bono in courts all over the county, and I just think that when I have cases with the LAPD, which rapidly bought and rolled out body-worn cameras in response to pressure from the mayor and the city council, when I have cases with the LAPD, the cameras reveal so much more than anyone in the courtroom would know otherwise. Before cameras, you would just read police reports authored by deputies, or in the case of LAPD officers. And, you'd have to rely on those. But when you now look at the body-worn camera footage, you often see things that are not put in the police reports. The same with the investigation of police shootings. It's just a real tool for transparency, in my opinion. And it's the kind of thing that cuts both ways. Because sometimes when an accusation is made against the deputies, they'll quickly deny it, or a member of the sheriff's leadership team will give a press conference with a very one-sided view of the account. And sometimes the camera will refute what the sheriff said and lend credibility to what maybe a member of our community who has been shot said about what happened, or who has been arrested said what happened. But then other times, I'll tell you, I've had to have that conversation with my client in criminal court, which is, your interpretation where these things happen. So I got the body-worn camera, and I don't see that. So let me play it for you right now, and let's talk about it. And then we can move on and decide what to do. So these body-worn cameras, I think, are really an important part of accountability and transparency. And although there are objections, speaking only for myself, I just strongly support them. And I think it's a real even-handed reform that I haven't heard good arguments from law enforcement about why we should not have them. The only thing I've heard is that we need more money. My view is that the sheriff's department has a multi-billion-dollar budget, and we should find a way to fully fund body-worn cameras. Now, one thing I just wanted to say is that the footage does no good if it's not released. And there have been criminal justice reforms, SB 1421, which has said that the public has a right to discover certain things, and that is anything to do with a police shooting, no matter what happened. If a deputy shoots her gun, it's discoverable under the new laws, as well as information about sexual assault and lying in the course of an investigation. And so many times when body-worn camera footage is held back, it creates a lot of problems. But the law enforcement organization says, well, we can't release that. After SB 1421, they can, in fact, they have a legal obligation. It puts them on a clock to do so. So I'm hoping the release of body-worn camera footage and highly inflammatory or emotional issues will help create evidence-based discussions about what happened. And that's why I think the cameras are so important, because sometimes they support the accusation, sometimes they refute the accusation. But in many ways, the camera footage is what it is. I mean, we can all view it for ourselves. This is another issue that I think is just critical to accountability in our community. And that's the issue of the so-called Brady list. Now, that's not, Brady list is not a term that everyone is familiar with. So while my students and I are very familiar with it because it's based on a famous US Supreme Court opinion from 1963 that says the prosecutor, this case Brady, says the prosecutor has to turn over evidence that tends to show that the accused person might be innocent, or any evidence that impeaches the prosecution witnesses, including the sheriff witnesses. And so evidence that a sheriff has lied in the past, or fabricated evidence, or found to be untruthful, those are all Brady information that the prosecutor is supposed to turn over. And we haven't been very good about this in Los Angeles because, we're just a gigantic county and in many ways very decentralized. And so over and over again, you see reversals of criminal convictions or wrongful convictions where people are exonerated because the Brady information was not turned over. And very often, it's because the impeachment information about a law enforcement witness was not turned over. And so our prior sheriff, Jim McDonnell, who was somewhat of a reformer on this issue, went through all the LASD files and made a list of the deputies who are currently employed and out there testifying in criminal trials and had this type of misconduct in their files, and he put them on a Brady list. And his intention was to give that list to the DA at the time, Jackie Lacey, so that both himself and District Attorney Lacey would meet their Brady obligations and stop the problem of what one judge called a, quote, Brady epidemic, unquote, that has spread all over our community. And the sheriff's unions, the Association of Los Angeles Deputy Sheriffs, ALADS, went to court and had a battle saying that information could not be turned over to the prosecution because information in a deputy's personnel file is secret under the police officer's Bill of Rights. Now, I don't want to get too legal, but your federal constitutional right to a fair trial, which is the basis of the Brady disclosure obligation for the prosecutor, it's pretty clear in American law and the hierarchy of law that that's going to trump state, California, statutory police personnel file confidentiality laws. And so eventually the California Supreme Court said, no, that information can't be turned over. In fact, it has to be turned over. And so I'm hoping that with that reform of the Brady list, that we'll see better outcomes, less convictions of innocent people, which are so sad, having represented someone who spent 30 years in prison for a murder he did not commit and was exonerated of. It's just heartbreaking to see people go through that experience. It's also super expensive for all of us. My client sued and got $10 million, and many other exonerees who suffered Brady violations have done the same. And so I'm hoping we'll see reform. Unfortunately, unlike Sheriff McDonald, Sheriff Villanueva has been very resistant, and my understanding is that the Brady list has not been turned over to the DA. They're going to try to comply in some other manner. I'm not sure what that would be. So as I told you, so many of the issues that create unfairness and tension between law enforcement and community members focus on the issue of police personnel file confidentiality. This is really two-sided as well, because on the one hand, deputy sheriffs are, they're public law enforcement officers. We all give them a salary, a gun, and the right to take away our freedom, to arrest us. And they do it in our name. So they're public government employees in some respects. And like I sit on the commission, which is a public commission, and I'm subject to the Brown Act and the Public Records Act. And so, it's frustrating, but that's part of doing a public function. So, I think many people say, no, they need to turn over this information because if you're shooting people, we want to know, do you have prior shootings? Do you have out of policy discipline? Have you lied in court? Have you made false statement in police reports? Are you a member of a deputy clique or gang? And the rationale is, well, the public needs to know that. We need to know that when we're assessing whether your testimony is correct, whether you should be working as a police officer, whether the statements that you have made publicly in press conferences should be believed. And so there's a real argument to release that. On the other side of the equation, I think there are very few people in this Zoom webinar who would be thrilled to have their kind of like personnel file at their place of work open to every member of the public. And so it's a balancing act. And as I said, the legislature recently passed police reform saying, well, it's a balancing act, but there are certain things like the areas I just recited: shootings, use of force that resulted in great bodily injury, sexual assault or attempted sexual assault, and lying in the course of investigation, where the balance tips in favor of public disclosure. That's a huge reform in California. Many people don't know it, but there is a fascinating law review article from, I believe it's a Stanford law review, that studied every state in the nation, and they found by far the confidentiality of police personnel records regarding misconduct. By far, the hardest state was California, to the point where, the author wondered how our confidentiality system could be constitutional, which is, I think, part of the reason why we're seeing reforms like this, because the information has just been kept secret so long, and it's resulted in problems. Some of you may have listened to the KPCC podcast Repeat, which is an amazing piece of investigative journalism in which a KPCC reporter went through a group of deputy sheriffs at the Century Station and found all the repeat shooters, despite many obstacles to her finding out that information. And she found that really a small number of deputies are responsible for a large number of shootings, and they're repeat shooters. And that's an example of information that, in my opinion, the public has a right to know. But there are legitimate issues on the other side, as I mentioned. And so this is an area, I think, where, as some reporters say, watch this space. I don't want to sound like a cable news person, but I think we're going to see lots of battles about where to tip that balance, because there's a new generation, and it brings a new view of policing. My students that I spend every day, all day with 23-year-olds, they look at policing issues so differently than I do. And I'm not saying either of us is right. I'm just saying there's much more skepticism of law enforcement rationalizations or arguments. And so I think we're going to start to see a lot of push about SB 1421 and the release of information. This is a area of great importance to me. My students and I spent 24 months, really literally almost every night and weekend, all of us doing a report on the phenomenon of deputy gangs or cliques within the LA Sheriff's Department. And we did it because we were simply shocked that this could go on as long as it has. We identified 18 different subgroups. Most have tattoos. Here are some of them. This skull with the red eyes is the Jump Out Boys. The card is the dead man's hand in poker. You can see the gun. There is a pamphlet that was seized from a patrol vehicle that was called the Jump Out Boys Creed. It said when you shot someone, the date, the deputy's name would be recorded in a black book of the gang. I'm going to call it a gang. I think that's what it is. And that he would earn the right to have his gun enhanced with smoke coming out of it. And this middle one is the Bandidos clique or gang. I think it's a gang operating out of the East LA station. East LA station is a real incubator of the gangs. The first known group, the Little Red Devils, started there. Another group, the Cavemen, came after that. We now have the Bandidos. I think it's not happenstance that The station calls itself Fort Apache, which I think many community members think is evidence that the station views itself as an army in an outpost amongst the savages, and there's a real hostile relationship between the station and some community members. Certainly not all members of the station. And then finally, the most recent gang identified in Compton, the Executioners. Here is a skeleton with a Nazi war helmet and looks like a Russian Kalashnikov gun, and the flames symbolize coming out of the gates of hell. These tattoos are representative. I mean, these are only some of the gangs or cliques, and they've been going on for about 50 years, and it's really, I think, hurt the relationship between the LA Sheriff's Department and many communities that they police. The gangs all tend to cluster around communities that have, on average, low incomes and high minority populations. So right now, the most active gangs are East LA, South LA, Compton, and the Antelope Valley. All communities that meet that definition. I've never heard of any sheriff gang activity in Marina Del Rey, Malibu, really anywhere on the west side. So it's an issue that I think has gone on for 50 years unchecked, that really demands looking further into. Many sheriffs have denied the existence of the gang, or when there was a scandal, they've begrudgingly conceded that maybe there's a clique and that they were going to do something, but they never follow up. I just wanted to throw out there, these are all the different outside commissions and oversight bodies over the years that have sounded the alarm about the gang culture within the LA Sheriff's Department. And you can see it spans for many years over a long period of time, and yet nothing has really been done. This is a town hall in East LA that the Civilian Oversight Commission held. And I put this picture because it's just startling to me. I've never seen anything like it, where so many people who are so upset show up talking about gangs with badges, and that they were fearful of the sheriff gangs. And while they're certainly no fan of the street gangs in their neighborhood, many community members expressed the concern that the sheriff gangs were worse because they operated with impunity. Nobody would stop them. The sheriff says the First Amendment creates real bars to him investigating and doing something about internal cliques and gangs. I don't think that's true. I've been a federal constitutional lawyer for a long time. I mean, as a 23-year-old, 23 years, I was a federal public defender litigating constitutional issues in federal court. And my understanding is that when you are a public government employee in a law enforcement agency, you do not have the same First Amendment protections regarding your work on the job as just a member of the citizen would. I mean, you have First Amendment rights, but they can be restricted in order to meet one's law enforcement mission. And so while a citizen may have the right to sport a Nazi tattoo because of the First Amendment, I do not think that the taxpayers of LA County have to employ someone with a Nazi tattoo as a armed law enforcement officer. And I will stand by that position, and I'm happy to debate it with anyone, because I think that is the law. And I'm hoping we'll see real change in response to enormous pressure from communities and the Civilian Oversight Commission To his credit, I want to say, Sheriff Villanueva it's been about a year now, did pass a policy outlawing participation in the cliques, as he calls them. But to my knowledge, so far, there's been no enforcement because of the reluctance to investigate based on the professed fears of violating First Amendment rights. Kind of wrapping up, because we want to have plenty of time to talk. The Measure R gave the Civilian Oversight Commission subpoena power, and by overwhelming vote, like over 70% of the voters voted for it, and they did it for a reason, because they saw that it is really hard to get information out of the department, and it's not limited to any personality. It's a long-standing institutional resistance at every level. So we now have subpoena power. Sheriff Villanueva, we've only used it, I think, once. He's stated that it's unconstitutional for our body to subpoena him, but he has lost in court. And he still continues to maintain that we can't subpoena him. So I guess we'll see. I don't think there is a real legal issue here. It's a cultural issue, in that for years the sheriff didn't have to answer to people in that way, and now they do. Here's a case that goes pretty far back at this point, Dibbs versus San Diego County, from the California Supreme Court, saying that provision of the government code 25303 authorizes our Board of Supervisors to supervise all county officers, including the sheriff. And he often, sheriffs, really guard their independence. And they say, well, I'm a constitutional officer, and Chris talked about this. But there's a center at Berkeley, the Center for the California Constitution, which does nothing but study and talk about the California Constitution. And its executive director addressed one of the sessions at Loyola's Policing LA Forum, and he said that it's not right. That the sheriff is a county officer. He's mentioned in the Constitution, but it's a county officer, and he's subject to some level of supervision by the Board of Supervisors who fund the agency. And it said that based on that, the board can create civilian oversight commissions, and the board can authorize those commissions to have subpoena power over the sheriff. And so to me, there's not really much of a legal argument there, but it continues. I do want to say that in the same opinion, our state high court said the Board of Supervisors, neither the board nor the civilian oversight can interfere with the sheriff's authority to investigate the crimes. They can ask questions. They can make sure money is being used properly. They can evaluate policies, but they can't interfere with the sheriff's core function. So maybe that's what he's saying. Chris had said, well, what about ideas? My guess is this group has lots of ideas itself, but a couple that come to me is we could amend our county charter to make it clear that the sheriff can be removed in ways other than just the election cycle, but it needs to be spelled out. We all should be litigating to enforce the Public Records Act. The legislative reforms mean nothing unless they are enforced. The Civilian Oversight Commission can and should hold more public hearings about issues and use its subpoena power, if necessary, to get the information relevant to those hearings. The Attorney General, even the sheriff doesn't contest, has the right to supervise and investigate misconduct in the department. That's actually going on right now. That happened after the report on deputy gangs was released. And finally, it's a real new era for police reform. There's so much reform coming out of Sacramento. It's hard to keep up with. And I think we really want to weigh in on those issues, because they're hard issues. Doing oversight for almost 5 years has made me realize that there are legitimate law enforcement issues that are not always apparent to me. But the sheriff needs to engage with civilians about how and why he takes the positions he does. And then he needs to really listen to input because, it's a public function. One great resource for talking about how to talk about reform is the president's task force on 21st century policing, because it was such a diverse group, many of whom were law enforcement, and yet it made sweeping recommendations about reform that is needed. And so I encourage members of the group to look at that document. It's very user friendly. Almost everything I advocate for is consistent with the task force on 21st century policing, which really talks about culture change at the sheriff's department, moving away from warriors who are fighting with the community, who are at war with the community, who distrust them, to guardians or servants who are engaged in the community and really want to talk to community members about the struggles of policing and keeping people safe, but also engaging in constitutional policing, reducing the number of shootings, stopping racially profiling. To me, that is the most important thing the sheriff can do, having those conversations. Many of the issues that are briefly discussed here are discussed in depth in panels of activists, scholars, sometimes members of law enforcement at Policing LA Forum at Loyola Law School. They're all posted on our website. Here is the site. I hope it's helpful to you. I think my 30 minutes is up, and Chris, I'll turn it over to you now.
Oh, hi. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Now let's see what questions you and the audience have for us, for Sean. And I'll start with a question that asks, have the members of the Board of Supervisors generally been supportive of the Commission's recommendations?
We have very little contact with supervisors. We issue reports. My impression is that they have been supportive of us, although I just don't interact with them a lot. We really are an independent body. So we investigate things and say what we think by consensus, and we fight with each other a lot, and then we send it over to the Board of Supervisors. However, I will say, I think often they are silent in the face of pretty startling information. I'm surprised that more hasn't been done affirmatively to stop hiding kind of like misconduct related to deputy gangs. I would think that every station should have body-worn cameras, and they still don't. I mean, it just wasn't that hard in LAPD to roll it out, and it just seems really slow. So yes, they're supportive, but I think they should be more affirmative in implementing the recommendations of the COC.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Why is it that Sheriff Villanueva has not been granted the opportunity to nominate someone to the Oversight Commission, but Sheriff McDonald was given the opportunity to have an appointment?
I'm not aware of Sheriff McDonald having an opportunity to nominate anybody. As I said, each supervisor nominates someone, and then recommendations were taken from the community at large, and a working group selected from that. I will say, I think law enforcement can, weigh in those community recommendations, and one of our members is a career retired lieutenant with the sheriff, a former president of the sheriff's union, J.P. Harris, is a commissioner. And what's interesting? JP and I are from very different backgrounds, but I would say 95% of the votes, we vote the same because the issues are often that clear.
Okay. Question. San Francisco yesterday won an award for their Department of Police Accountability Use of Force audit. Are there other cities you also recommend people look to for examples of good use of force audits?
San Francisco has been a real leader in this respect, and I really think that looking to them is the way to go. I also think best practices put out by NACOL, which is kind of like the national group of civilian oversight best practices group. It has scholars, law enforcement advisors, civilian oversight officials, and they put out a lot of information about best practices, including audits. And I think those are really good blueprints for that kind of study, because auditing, I believe, is one of the keys to having real accountability instead of oversight theater.
Okay, great. Are there any municipalities which are having success balancing respecting union and the confidentiality of human relations files with the public need to know, which we could look to? Did the Stanford study raise up good examples?
The Stanford study has numerous examples, and it's called Brady's Blind Spot is the name of the article. And I think that is the place for us to look. But I'd like to point out that, like in Florida, which I don't think of as a raving liberal state, they have sunshine laws on police personnel files. And, the sky doesn't fall. I think what happens really is law enforcement unions are such a powerful voice in Sacramento. They are such an outsized voice in the political arena that the balance has not been struck in California fairly for a long time. And I'm speaking only for myself here. And the good thing about release of misconduct information is it builds trust. It seems bad in the beginning, and I often see sheriff leadership kind of in a bunker, like let's hide these problems. But when you release it and you develop a culture of honesty and releasing information, you can still weigh in and contextualize it and give your point of view and explain why you don't think it's as bad as that. But then there's real conversations in the public forum, and the problem is when it's hidden.
Okay. Do you believe the LA County Sheriff should be appointed by the Board of Supervisors or elected by the people of LA County?
It's a hard question that I think reasonable people could disagree with. So I have respect for both sides of the issue. Myself, I think appointed is where I would land, because I just have seen what I think is LAPD pushed to be more open, to reform more, to be more transparent. And I think it's a direct function of appointment. And when you study sheriffs across the land who are elected, they drag on reform. They're slow to reform because they don't have that incentive. They run countywide, and some people would say, well, that's the accountability. And I understand that. But when I see appointed officials, I just see a lot more engagement with civilian officials. And to me, that collaborative engagement minded relationship is the key. All the laws in the world will not change the problem. The problem is, does the agency embrace constitutional policing, community policing, and culture change? Do they embrace it? And so that's why I think appointed might be the way to go. Like New York City has an appointed sheriff. And so there are jurisdictions that do it, but by far the majority are elected. It's built into our American DNA, and particularly the expansion of the West, where the sheriff as the human symbol of the law is deep in our Western mythology. So it's a tall order. And so I'm making a plea for transparency and engagement, whether elected or appointed.
You want to do a real quick rundown of the pros and cons of election and appointment, or not?
Well, I mean, I have my own views. I think there's a certain legitimacy that comes from election. I've never met elected officials. I mean, people who run for election, they respect each other when they're in the room because they've all had a run for election in a way that they don't respect appointed officials always anyway. So I think there's that. But appointment allows, I think, people who are outside the sheriff's department to have more of a voice and to have more opportunity to collaborate in the formulation of training and policy. And training and policy are everything in terms of reducing police violence and creating good police culture. And so there's that. The other thing is the way our system is set up with the election. You have to be a law enforcement officer to run for election. So it leaves out a lot of good candidates, in my opinion, because running a huge multi-billion-dollar agency with thousands of employees and a really important mission that involves incarcerating people and using violence against people in the name of the public, it has a lot of skills other than being a trained law enforcement officer. And I think just as we've seen movements for progressive prosecutors, there's going to be a push for progressive sheriffs, and opening that up might change that dynamic.
Okay. What and where are the major recruiting sources for sheriff's deputies?
No, I don't really know. I don't think we know. This is an example, I think, of we need to know more about how they're recruiting. I know that there aren't enough women deputies in the department. And I know that sheriff leadership tells me that they're having a difficult time recruiting. But more public information about who they're hiring and the standards for hiring and how they're vetting candidates, I think would really benefit us all, particularly in the area of deputy shootings.
Okay. In the county that contains San Francisco, which I think is San Francisco County because they're coterminous, aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, they are.
The sheriff controls the jails, but a separate police force controlled by the Board of Supervisors handles all other policing. This did not require a constitutional amendment. Please discuss the pros and cons of this for LA County.
Well, this is the government code section that I was referring to in the case dibs that I talked about, whereas the sheriff is a county officer subject to the supervision of the Board of Supervisors. And so I'm not sure it's so much constitutional amendments. That's a narrative that almost all sheriffs put out. My understanding from the Center on the California Constitution at Berkeley Law School is that it's really about revising our county charter in going for the charter to redefine the duties of the sheriff and talk about budgetary and removal procedures. Those are all within the realm of the county charter. So that's where I think we really need to look. And the pros and cons are, to me, an example is for the sheriff department to investigate itself on deputy shootings is an impossible endeavor. I'm not going to even be critical of them. I just think it's impossible for them to investigate in-house objectively, which is why we have kind of seen the evaluations that we've seen, and we could clearly farm that out to a third party to do that, and I think we should. I think it would create a better system. So the mechanisms for tinkering with how the sheriff's department works, what functions they're responsible for, and what functions can be transferred to other organizations that are not law enforcement oriented but have expertise in certain areas. I think those are the discussions that should be on the table, and that we should be having a lot more of in LA than we are having right now.
Okay. If Los Angeles County cannot agree on reforms and implement them, would a federal court suit and a federal oversight be a good reform alternative?
Over and over again, I think we have seen that consent decrees and federal court oversight has been a way to open up the path towards reform. We saw more of that under the Obama administration. It almost stopped completely under President Trump. I suspect we're going to see more under the Biden administration. So I think that the consent decrees are just an important part of ensuring accountability. Federal judges are appointed for life. They can make decisions that are very difficult to make. That's exactly why the Constitution was designed the way it is. And so for me, when I see passive responses to really troubling problems like deputy gangs and all the things that go with something like that, it's an example where outside consent decrees and federal leadership would help. It would never completely solve the problem, because I stand by my statement. The problem will never be solved until sheriff leadership is committed to culture change, which is we're going to be transparent. We are going to be open to civilian oversight. We are going to look outward to the communities that we serve and collaborate with them about how to best police these communities.
Okay. Is there any difference in training for a police officer and a sheriff deputy?
I don't know, because I don't know the LAPD side well enough. Mm-hmm. I do know that in general, in American policing, there is much less training than in other countries' policing, much less. And I don't know if that's why we see different outcomes. But it just seems like more training. I'm just going to talk about the training I know. More training would be so helpful. And it would also create great conversations, because I went through something they call Milo training that deputy sheriffs go through. And they give you a gun, and they put you in a room with a scenario in which you have to react to unfolding violence. And after I went through that and watched many others go through it, actual deputies go through it, it made me realize the complexity of training and deputy shootings and enforcement of policy. One thing, so the first thing it did is made me more compassionate for the deputies and the scenarios that they face on the streets. The other thing is I noticed like the training was really good, but there wasn't a lot of diversity in the scenarios, and on the streets there's a lot of diversity. And I thought with implicit bias and the issues of diversity in our culture, why isn't it more diverse? And then there was extensive discussion from the sergeant about compliance with policy regarding weapons, but there was almost no weigh-in from a clinician who is specially trained to help people deal with mental health in crisis, which is what many of the scenarios were. In fact, all of the scenarios were about dealing with mentally ill people in crisis. And there was almost no discussion from a trained mental health professional about de-escalating. So if you're always focusing on hands, guns, don't get killed, go home at night, I think it creates a certain type of training when you could discuss all those things and then also have a discussion about fear, techniques for de-escalation, the importance of the community member going home at night as well. You know, the humanization of the people that they're interacting with who are in crisis. And so I think a lot more attention to training would really produce better outcomes.
I think we have a time for one more question. It's a two-part question. What requirements and accountability is there for the individual deputy to have body cams on when making a stop? And secondly, what civil rights accountability exists, especially in low income and ethnic communities, and where does transparency exist within the department?
That's a lot. So the cameras are supposed to be on whenever you are interacting with members of the public. So there's the presumption is they're supposed to be on, and there are set exceptions, but they're rare. I think that the issue of accountability for civil rights violations is a good one. There's a lot of I think conversations about the immunity issues and whether we should, kind of reevaluate those. I think that's probably the biggest part of accountability. And is there transparency in communities, particularly minority communities? I'm sorry to say, I think the answer is we're not there yet. We have a long way to go in Los Angeles County before we have transparency. And it's one of the fundamental motivators that keeps me on the commission because it's contentious, difficult position, but accountability is one of the pillars transparency is one of the pillars of reform that is talked about in the report on 21st century policing. And when you're transparent, I think the next thing that is going to come is when people see what you're doing, it's going to concern them and they're going to want to talk to you. So transparency will lead to outward looking engagement with communities and how they are policed. And it's really stark because doing pro bono representation just last weekend before last, I usually I'm in Pasadena on a Sunday, and I have to say I never run into law enforcement officers. But I went to a community in South LA for 3 hours to investigate, and my students and I ran into police at least 25 times. And so it just shows, that one fact, I think, invites conversations about policing and what the problem is. Is the problem that those kids are committing crime 24/7? is the problem. There's a lot of over-policing and a lot of interaction that doesn't occur in other communities. I'm not saying I know the solution, and it has been humbling on the commission because a lot of what I thought I knew about policing, I was wrong. But I was wrong for a reason. It's a black box. It is hidden from all of us, even though policing is done in all of our names. And I think we all have a responsibility to find out what is going on. I know Chris will like his message for what is going on with policing in your community. Because if you agree with it, great. Once you know and you agree with it, you can support it. If you don't agree with it, you can say, I would like to be heard. I would like to ask questions. I would like to know why we're doing this. And it's those conversations that will move the needle of culture change. And in the end, the only thing that will solve the problem is significant culture change.
Thank you so much, Sean, for your good information and encouragement to continue to work for greater transparency and accountability. And in closing, I want to invite league members who who are watching to work with us to become observers and maybe participants at the Oversight Commission's monthly meetings. There should be a slide on how to get in touch with the commission, how to get a hold of the meetings. But that's part of our job. So we'll be trying to do as good a job as we can. Thank you again.
Thank you for the opportunity to address a well-informed, engaged audience. I really appreciate it.
Good.
Ashley, if you can help us out with some take action activity.
Thank you, Martha. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully you all can see that. It's loading. All right. So my name is Ashley Ravichet. I'm the Deputy Director of Social Policy for the League of Women Voters of California. I first want to thank the Pasadena League for inviting me today to highlight two very important bills is advocating for in this legislative session. We had a wonderful presentation by Sean Kennedy that really hit on some aspects of league policy that we supported under AB 1185. Therefore, now that it's law, your league is able to take up the issue and to continue to advocate. So let me go into some areas of advocacy that is not yet law, that the league is working very hard to advocate for, so I'm amplifying the message for you. The first I will discuss is AB 256, the California Racial Justice Act for All. It's a bill that the league is co-sponsoring. Next, I will share some information on SB police. It's a police decertification bill that the ACLU is co-sponsoring with the league's strong support. Let's reshare. Technology is a wonderful thing until it stops working for us. There we go. All right, routinely upheld despite blatantly racist statements by attorneys, judges, jurors, and expert witnesses, and the exclusion of all or nearly all Black, Brown, Native, Indigenous, and other people of color from juries. The League of Women Voters believes that there is no such thing as too much justice, and that demanding a fair and equitable system should not be overly burdensome. This is Paula from San Jose, launching the California Racial Justice Act in March of 2020. We are back again this year with AB 256, asking our legislature to stand to the law for all. So let me do a deeper dive on what the Racial Justice Act is and help explain why we believe everyone should have access to it. The Racial Justice Act prohibits the state from using discriminating means to seek or obtain a criminal sentence or conviction. In the act, we reject treating discrimination as harmless and to address some of the discrimination we are seeing. This includes explicit bias against the defendant based on their race, ethnicity, or national origin, such as calling the defendant a terrorist or the dehumanizing tactic of allowance, bias at trial and in jury selection, whether or not this is directed at the defendant. This includes actions by law enforcement officers. Statistical disparities in charging, sentencing, and convictions. To put it simply, Racial Justice Act for All ensures that all Black and Brown people have a path to challenge racist convictions and sentences. For all includes people who are currently incarcerated and have been left out of reforms that California has achieved over the last 20 years. Human rights do not have a timeline. They do not expire and should not be limited because of inaction. Did you know that more than 50% are Black, Latinx, Asian, or Native American? Their Institute reports that beginning in the 1960s, racist law and order rhetoric emerged in politics, which ushered in the era of mass incarceration, flipping the racial prisons in the United States to majority Black by the 1990s. A survey by the U.S. Sentencing Commission in 2017 found that when Black men on average received a sentence almost 20% longer, and Black men convicted of a felony are 42% more likely to be sentenced to prison than a white man convicted of a felony. We spend on average $91,000 a year to incarcerate one person. Compare this to the $12,000 each year that we spend to educate one child. Allowing racism to persist in the legal system is costing our families and our communities for racism and look at the institutions of justice with an eye towards healing and uplifting the dignity of all our shared humanity. AB 256, the Racial Justice Act for All, offered protections to those who've already been harmed by an unfair conviction or sentence, providing that individual equal opportunity to pursue justice under the law. Our co-sponsor team has been working with the judicial and the newly adopted process so that our courts may better apply the current law and also expand access to the Racial Justice Act to help those who are currently incarcerated. We know that there are costs for this implementation of the retroactivity of the Racial Justice Act. Ultimately, however, by providing access to those individuals who are currently incarcerated, there will also be cost savings from the release. In the end, this bill will pay for itself. AB 256 is currently on the Assembly Appropriations Suspense file, and we're working to garner support by labor groups and in-district members like yourself. As now, not much. We are already co-sponsoring this bill. But if you want to know more, you can sign up to get Racial Justice Act for All, RJA for All updates. I'll send you some links in the chat. You could ask other organizations to write a letter of support. You can share your support message on social media, tagging our author, tagging Confront, hashtag Confront Racism, and I'll give you some again in the chat. I'm going to move on to the next bill, Senate Bill 2, Kenneth Ross Jr. Police Decertification Act. We all deserve to live in communities. Law enforcement officers are given more authority than any other profession, the power to stop, search, arrest, and even use deadly force on members of our community. This power means that the state has a greater responsibility to hold these officers accountable. We have allowed cops under the current law who have been fired or who resign while under investigation to avoid accountability, to bounce from community to community while still being able to wield their power over others. A Yale study found that wandering officers who move from one agency to the next are significantly more likely to incur complaints of their Women Voters believes in accountability and transparency as a cornerstone of our organization. Senate Bill 2 will help provide both. The Let Us Live Coalition with the ACLU is mobilizing to stop these abusive cops from acting above the law by working to pass SB 2. California is one in this country that has no process to decertify abusive cops who commit serious misconduct, so they can no longer be hired as police officers in other places. Decertification ensures that our communities are safe from those who seek to throw the law out the window. Senate Bill 2, what it does, I'll just give some highlights here. It establishes a statewide process for specified misconduct, such as excessive force, sexual misconduct, and dishonesty. It gives the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, or POST, the power to independently investigate allegations and decertify officers who resign before they are fired. This is especially important for areas that do not have oversight commissions like yours. It would also require that local law and make sure that all law enforcement agencies contact the state to learn why an officer left their previous position. SB 2 will also allow more family members to sue officers when their civil rights have been violated. This bill will ensure that the officers we employ to uphold our laws are held to basic standards, and they're removed from our communities when they violate those basic. Have been fired for excessive force, sexual misconduct, and dishonesty should not be allowed to continue to patrol our communities. California must do more to protect Black people from deadly police officers. Addressing police violence requires re-examining the role of police in our society, reimagining how to advance public safety by investing in resources not involve law enforcement. So what can you do? You can sign up to get updates and alerts. You can ask your elected officials to support SB 2. And ask other nations that participated to write a letter of support. Again, the League is already in strong support of this. And you can continue to share information about SB 2 on social media. Thank you so much for taking time, ways which your organization and yourself as an individual can confront racism. Senate Bill 2 is on the Senate Appropriations Suspense file. Our Deputy Director, Dora Rose, and the ACLU are collaborating on a direct advocate. What this means is that if you have not signed up for the action alerts on lwvc.org, go ahead and do so. When action alerts come down from the state, it's a simple click away for league or elected officials. I really appreciate you making space and time for me today to share information about the two bills the League of Women Voters of California is sponsoring and supporting. And I really appreciate how your community and your local league is demanding accountability and advocating for just and equitable. Let me go ahead and do my chat. These are links to supporting the Racial Justice Act and social media toolkit that if you are on social media, you make it easy to click away and share, and we will continue to add information to that. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was great information. And thank you to Commissioner Kennedy for joining us today. After such a tumultuous year characterized by inexcusable police violence, you've given us much to consider and much to do to ensure police practices are designed to keep residents safe. It's evident that the concept of the thin blue line is actively operating, probably leading to the evolution of the focus on law and order versus public safety. And that belief that only the police are holding back the tide of mayhem and anarchy, and that any transgression must be put down before all hell breaks loose. It will take concerted effort to turn this around. It will take all of us. And Ashley, thank you for joining us today and giving us take action information to address the racism operating in our criminal justice system. If you could share my slides, please, host. We have, we do want to let you know that we have some information for you on where to take and get information. We just want to tell you, our attendees, that if we didn't get to your questions, please resubmit them via email to events@lwvpa.org. We'll get the answers to you. We'll bring up that slide momentarily. But for now, this is the information you need to go to the Loyola Law School public workshops that you can actually learn more and sign up to attend, or just email us at our social justice lwv-pa.org so that you can get these links available to you. Next slide, please. And the LA County Civilian Oversight Commission is available to you. Again, just email us at socialjustice@lwv-pa.org, and we can share the information with you so that you can really get actively engaged. It's such an important piece of information to make sure that we are keeping our sheriff accountable. So again, the next slide, we can show you our events page where you can submit any questions you may have about still on the police practices or the take action information that Ashley provided. For our members, please remember to go register this afternoon for our annual meeting, which is scheduled for June 3rd. And for all our audience, remember the video of this presentation will be available on LWVPA's website, our YouTube channel, tomorrow, courtesy of Pasadena Media. Thank you to our events and communications committees for working behind the scenes to host the event. today. And thank you to Chris Oskershauser, our moderator during the Q&A session. And finally, to our Zoom hosts, Valerie Jones and Kitty Kroger. Thank you, our audience, for sharing your day with us, and get out there and please take action.